Danger might be closer than you think. Before we begin, like this video, comment where and what time you're watching from, and subscribe for more chilling stories. Now turn off the lights, get comfortable, and let's dive into the unknown. Story 1. I had never been one to drink coffee, but that night I had no choice. It was my last chance to study before the most important exam of the semester, and my dorm room felt too small to contain my anxiety. So, I grabbed my backpack and headed to a coffee shop I'd never noticed before. It was a small place, tucked away between two closed stores, with a faded sign and a dark wooden counter that looked as if it had stories to tell. I'm not sure why I went in. Maybe because all other options were closed, or perhaps because the biting cold that night pushed me into any place with warmth. As I entered, the bell above the door jingled, and a thin man with thinning hair and a crumpled uniform stared at me from behind the counter. He didn't say anything, just looked at me for an uncomfortable moment before asking in a slow drawl, "What'll it be?" The place was empty. There was no music, just the hum of an old refrigerator in the corner, and the sound of the wind outside. I ordered a strong coffee, exactly what I needed to endure the night. The barista didn't smile or even make that automatic gesture of acknowledging the order. He simply turned around slowly and started preparing the drink. As I waited, I looked around. The chairs were perfectly aligned, as if no one had moved them all day. There were no dirty dishes, crumpled napkins, or any indication of other customers. It bothered me, but not enough to leave. After all, I just needed a coffee. It was only when I took the first sip that I realized something was very wrong. The taste wasn't just bad. It wasn't simply burnt coffee or poorly ground beans. It was something strange, almost chemical, too bitter, but not in the way strong coffee should be. A taste that stuck to my tongue and sent a strange warmth sliding down my throat. I frowned and stirred the drink with the plastic spoon, as if that could change anything. Maybe the milk had gone bad, I thought. Maybe I was just imagining things. But when I looked up, the barista was still there on the other side of the counter watching me, without hiding it, without looking away, as if he was waiting for something. Suddenly I felt light, not in a good way, but as if my body was slowly shutting down. My fingers tingled when I tried to grip the cup, and a slight dizziness started clouding my vision. A chill ran up my spine, but I tried convincing myself it was just exhaustion, just anxiety finally catching up after a long day. But then I saw the barista take a step back, still watching me. Calmly, without hurry, he took out a set of keys from his pocket, and without breaking eye contact, turned the lock on the front door. The metallic click echoed through the empty cafe. My heart raced. Immediately I tried to stand, but my legs were heavy, as if filled with lead. The dizziness worsened, and the world around me seemed to spin for a second. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my body was no longer cooperating. The barista, now standing next to the locked door, tilted his head slightly, as if studying my reaction. "Better finish your coffee," he said, in a calm, almost gentle tone. But that forced gentleness only twisted my stomach further. My mind was screaming that something was terribly wrong. I forced a smile, trying to hide the fear rising in my chest like a violent tide. "I think I'm feeling a little sick. Maybe I should go," I murmured, attempting to sound casual. My hands trembled as I pretended to look for my wallet inside my backpack. Any excuse to buy time. The barista didn't immediately respond. He just kept watching, dark and sunken eyes fixed on me as if they could see right through my skin. Then he took a step toward me, then another, slow, controlled, as if he knew I wouldn't have the strength to escape. The air inside the cafe felt heavier, each breath becoming harder. The barista was now just a few steps away, and I could see his face more clearly under the yellowish counter light. There was something off about him. Not just the calculated expression, but his skin seemed wrong, slightly damp, reflecting the light strangely. "You don't look well," he said, and the way the words came out, slow and deliberate, made my skin crawl. I needed to do something, anything, before he got closer. I tried standing again, summoning every ounce of control I had left over my legs. I leaned on the table, knocking over the cup in the process. Coffee spilled over the dark wooden surface, dripping slowly onto the floor. The barista stared at the spilled liquid for a moment, and that brief distraction was all I needed. With a sudden movement, I threw my backpack at him, hitting his chest and pushing him back. The dizziness blurred my vision, but I didn't think. I dragged myself toward the door, my trembling hands desperately searching for the lock he'd just turned. My fingers slipped over the latch, sweaty and shaking. I pulled and twisted the handle forcefully, but the dizziness made everything feel distant, like trying to open a door underwater. Behind me, I heard a dull noise, the barista recovering from the impact of my backpack. "You don't need to do that," he said, now in a different tone. Lower, colder, the type of voice that makes your stomach sink. Blood pounded in my ears, and then I felt it. The key was still in the lock. My fingers closed around the keys. I pulled and twisted the knob desperately, but dizziness made everything feel distant, as if I were trying to open a door underwater. Behind me, I heard the barista's voice, now different, lower, colder, the kind of voice that makes your stomach sink. "You don't need to do that," he said. My pulse pounded in my ears, and that's when I felt it. The key was still in the lock. My fingers closed tightly around it. Just as I did, I saw the barista move toward me from the corner of my eye, his thin hand reaching out, coming closer. In pure reflex, I shoved the door open with my shoulder, stumbling outside, nearly falling onto the cold sidewalk. The freezing night air slapped my face, restoring some clarity. But before I could run, I glanced back. The barista hadn't chased me or shouted after me. He stood there, motionless beneath the street lamp's pale glow. His face, already pale, seemed even more drained of color. His eyes. Something was terribly wrong with his eyes. Deep and dark, they looked as though there was a void inside, bigger than should ever fit. He simply stood there, watching me, with a smile so chilling that it froze me in place, paralyzing me with a fear I'd never known. Then, still smiling, he slowly stepped back and closed the door. My breathing was rapid, my head still spinning. I knew I needed to run, but something about that smile had frozen me in place, overwhelmed by a fear I had never experienced before. Finally, my legs obeyed, and I forced myself to walk, then run. The streets were empty, and the icy night wind cut my skin, but I didn't stop. Eventually, I reached my dorm room, stumbling through the door and collapsing onto the floor, gasping for air. My head pounded, and the chemical taste lingered on my tongue. I wasn't sure if it was real or just fear making me relive it. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat up in bed, staring at the door, my heart racing, the bitter taste still in my mouth. I drank water, brushed my teeth, tried to spit it out, but the bitterness persisted, haunting me long into the morning. Despite having stayed awake all night, I went to class the next day, but my mind wasn't there. Everything felt distant, disconnected, like I was watching from afar. Curious, or maybe driven by unease, I tried searching online for the cafe. Nothing. No reviews, no photos, no address, as if it had never existed. Anxiety rose within me. Had I typed it wrong? Was it just an old place no one had bothered to document online? The thought didn't convince me. Later that day, driven by unease, I returned to the location. But when I arrived, there was no cafe, just an old abandoned building. The structure appeared far older than any place I would have accidentally entered. The windows were covered in dust, the front door locked with rusty chains. It seemed like no one had set foot inside for years. Approaching the grimy window, I peered in. The interior was dark, but through the dust-covered glass I could see tables thickly coated in dust and chairs overturned, untouched for years. I stepped back, heart pounding in my throat. Then I noticed something on the glass, a clear spot where someone had recently wiped away the dust, exactly at eye level, as if peering out from within. My blood ran cold. Someone, or something, had watched me. Worse, it seemed they knew I'd return. That smile drawn in the dust wasn't an accident. It was intentional, deliberate. My breathing became shallow, my body screaming at me to leave. I knew I shouldn't be there. Every fiber of my being urged me to flee. Whoever or whatever had seen me expected my return. That drawn smile wasn't random. Fear surged within me, stronger than ever. Even now, months later, sleepless nights still bring back that bitter chemical taste. And I can't help but wonder, what would have happened if I'd stayed? Story 2. I'd always enjoyed working from coffee shops, rotating between different places each day. I like the ambient noise, the smell of freshly ground coffee beans, and the sensation of being surrounded by life while typing endless reports. On that particular day, I chose a small cafe, somewhat hidden in the city center, the kind of place that doesn't appear in any guides. It wasn't the fact that the boy was alone that caught my attention. It was how he was sitting, small, thin, maybe 8 or 9 years old, alone at a table, not drinking, not fiddling with a cell phone, not flipping through a book, just sitting there, perfectly still. Occasionally he'd sip his drink, but he never looked around or fidgeted like kids usually do when waiting for someone. It felt as though he were frozen in time. After an hour, I began to feel uneasy. Children don't just sit alone for that long without reason. I finally approached the counter, whispering discreetly to the barista, "Hey, that boy over there, is he waiting for someone?" The woman, who had seemed calm until then, immediately grew tense. Her eyes darted subtly toward the boy's table before returning to mine. After a moment of hesitation, she replied, lowering her voice, "We asked. He just keeps saying his dad is coming." She didn't sound relieved by her own explanation. I glanced back at the boy, who now seemed even smaller and lonelier at the empty table. He'd been there for hours. My instincts screamed that something was deeply wrong. "Did you try talking to him more? Asking about his father?" I whispered to the barista. She nodded grimly, her face lacking any comfort. "He just repeats the same thing, over and over." My instincts urged me to do something. Slowly, I approached his table. He didn't react as I stood beside him. "Hey, sweetheart, are you waiting for someone?" I asked gently. He blinked slowly, not raising his head. "My dad is coming soon," he replied quietly. I tried another approach, attempting not to alarm him. "Okay, what's your dad's name?" This time he hesitated. His small fingers tightened around the cup of now cold chocolate, and he slowly lifted his eyes toward me. They were unsettlingly deep and solemn. "My dad," he repeated softly. I glanced around the cafe, hoping someone else had noticed and shared my discomfort, but no one seemed bothered. The cafe had filled and emptied several times since my arrival, but the boy remained there, unchanged, unnoticed. And that's when something struck me. The place had cycled through multiple customers, but no one else seemed to see him. The world around his table felt oddly slowed down, disconnected from everything else. My heart quickened as I realized this. Something was terribly wrong. My fingers closed around the key, and I twisted it with all the strength I had left. The click of the lock was loud, but I had no time to feel relief. The barista moved quickly, too quickly. I saw him from the corner of my eye, already close, his pale hand reaching out toward me. In pure reflex, I shoved the door with my shoulder, stumbling out onto the cold sidewalk. The icy night air hit me like a slap, bringing a small moment of clarity. But before I could run, I glanced back, and for 1 second, just 1 second, I saw something that froze me in place. The barista still stood there, framed in the open doorway, but something about him looked wrong. His eyes had changed. It wasn't just the strange stare from before. Now there was something deep, dark, as if his pupils contained a void much larger than they should. His face, which had seemed pale earlier, was even more drained of color beneath the street lamp's light. He didn't chase after me, didn't shout. He just stood there, smiling. But it wasn't a human smile. Something was wrong with his mouth, as though the corners of his lips were stretched slightly too far, as if his skin was trying and failing to hold itself together. My chest rose and fell rapidly, my head still spinning. I knew I had to run, but something in that smile rooted me in place, paralyzed by a fear I had never felt before. And then, still smiling, he stepped backward and closed the door. Just like that, as if nothing had happened, as if I were just another customer leaving. I stood there on the sidewalk, feeling the world spin around me. Whatever had been in that coffee, whatever was in my body, still lingered, now mixed with a horrible certainty. If I had stayed 1 minute longer, just one, I might never have left. Finally, my legs obeyed, and I forced myself to walk, then to run. The streets were empty, the cold night wind slicing my skin, but I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I just wanted distance from that place, from that impossible smile, from the bitter taste still clinging to my mouth. I don't know how long I ran or how I managed to reach my dorm. All I remember is closing the door behind me and sliding down to the floor, chest heaving uncontrollably. My head still throbbed, and the chemical taste lingered on my tongue, but I couldn't tell if it was real or just fear making me relive it. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat on my bed staring at the door, feeling with each passing minute that something was still terribly wrong. My body gradually returned to normal, but the sensation of being watched didn't fade, as if the coffee was still inside me, as if that barista was still waiting for the effects to take hold, waiting for it to do whatever he intended. Worst of all, even hours later, after drinking water, trying to spit it out, brushing my teeth, the bitter taste remained. The next day, despite the lack of sleep, I went to class, but my mind wasn't there. Everything felt distant, disconnected, as though I were watching my own life unfold without truly being part of it. The bitter taste lingered in my mouth, not as strong, but still there, a subtle reminder that something wasn't right. During a break, almost without thinking, I grabbed my phone and searched for the name of the cafe. Nothing. No records, no reviews, no photos. As if the place had never existed. Anxiety tightened its grip on me. Had I typed it wrong? Was the place simply so old no one had ever bothered to register it online? But that idea didn't convince me. I had been there. I tasted that coffee. I saw that smile. I needed proof. So later that same night, despite the fear gnawing at my stomach, I decided to return. I had to see for myself if the place was still there. But when I arrived on the street where the cafe should have been, all I found was an abandoned building. The building appeared old, far older than any place I would have willingly entered without noticing. The windows were covered in dust, and the front door was locked with rusted chains. There was no sign, no indication a cafe had ever operated there. Yet I knew it was the right spot. The building number, its position between the stores, even the street light, all exactly matched the cafe I'd entered the previous night. My heart pounded so strongly I felt it in my throat. I approached the dirty glass cautiously, trying to peer inside. Everything was dark, but I could make out dusty tables and overturned chairs, untouched for years. I stepped back, chills running up my spine. How was this possible? Yesterday, I'd sat there drinking that strange coffee, watched by a barista who clearly didn't want me to leave. But now, it was just an abandoned building. A strange smell drifted in with the wind, sending a shiver through my body. That's when I noticed something else. On the dusty glass at eye level, there was a spot that had recently been wiped clean, as if someone had rubbed their hand across it to look out. And behind the dust, faint but unmistakable, was something that turned my stomach. A smile drawn with a finger. My feet froze to the ground. I wanted to run, to look around and confirm it was just my imagination, but I knew it wasn't. Someone or something had watched me. Worse yet, it seemed to have known I would return. That smile on the glass wasn't accidental. My breathing became short, panic gripping me. Every part of my body screamed for me to turn around and never come back, and that's exactly what I did. After that night, I never walked by that street again, never looked for that cafe again. But even today, whenever I drink coffee slightly more bitter than it should be, something twists inside me. The chemical taste returns briefly, and for a fleeting moment I'm back at that table, beneath the watchful gaze of the barista. And on sleepless nights lying awake in the dark, I can't help but wonder, what would have happened if I'd stayed? Story 3. Back then, I worked remotely and often rotated through various cafes during the day. I liked the ambient sounds, the smell of ground coffee beans, the feeling of being surrounded by life as I typed endless reports. On that particular day, I chose a small cafe, slightly hidden downtown, the kind of place that doesn't appear in tourist guides, but that locals know well. I grabbed my drink, chose a table by the window, and dove into my laptop. Everything seemed normal until I noticed the boy. He was sitting alone at a table near the counter, holding a cup of hot chocolate. Small, thin, perhaps 8 or 9 years old. But what caught my attention wasn't just the fact that he was alone. It was the way he sat there, completely still, not touching his drink, not fiddling with a phone, not flipping through a book. Just sitting, his small dark eyes fixed on the table in front of him, as if waiting for something, or someone. I watched him for a while, expecting an adult to approach him, but no one came. Time passed, and the boy remained immobile. Occasionally, he would take a small sip from his chocolate, but he never glanced around, never swung his legs under the table, never showed those absent-minded movements children make when waiting for someone. It was as though he were frozen in time. After about an hour, I began to feel uneasy. No child remains alone for that long without becoming restless. No guardian appeared to pick him up, and no one in the cafe seemed to notice his presence. Unease grew inside my chest. I didn't want to seem intrusive, but something about the situation didn't add up. So, when the barista wasn't too busy, I approached the counter. "Hey, that boy over there, is he waiting for someone?" I whispered, trying to sound casual. The woman, who had seemed calm until then, suddenly tensed. Her eyes discreetly moved to the boy's table before returning to mine. She hesitated, then leaned slightly toward me and murmured, "He arrived this morning. Said his dad would pick him up, but nobody came." A shiver ran down my spine. This morning. I glanced at the boy again, and suddenly he seemed even smaller at that empty table. He'd been there for hours. My instincts screamed that something was terribly wrong. "Did you try talking to him? Asking about his father?" I whispered to the barista. She nodded, but her face showed no relief. "He just repeats the same thing. My dad is coming." The way she said it unsettled me deeply. It sounded like she'd heard that phrase too many times, in a way that didn't seem natural. My heart tightened. Something inside me said I needed to do something. So taking a deep breath, I approached the boy's table. He didn't move when I stopped beside him. "Hi, sweetie. Are you waiting for someone?" I asked, keeping my voice gentle. He blinked slowly and without lifting his head replied, "My dad is coming soon." His voice was small, barely a whisper, but the way he said it sent chills down my spine. Because there was no emotion there, no impatience, no anxiety. Just a simple fact, repeated like a distant echo. That answer didn't convince me. Something felt wrong, but I didn't want to scare him. So, I tried another approach. "All right, what's your dad's name?" This time he took longer to reply. His tiny fingers gripped the cold chocolate cup tighter, and he finally lifted his eyes toward me. His eyes were deep, dark. "He's coming," he repeated, his voice small, emotionless, as if stating a distant fact. My mouth went dry. I glanced around the cafe, hoping someone else noticed. Someone else was just as unsettled, but no one seemed to pay attention. Time seemed to slow down around that table. And then something hit me that made my blood run cold. Customers had already come and gone several times since I'd arrived, yet no one appeared to notice him. The world seemed to slow around his table, isolating us from the cafe's ordinary rhythm. I froze in place, my chest tight. Before I could step away, the doorbell jingled. The cafe's atmosphere seemed to grow heavier, as if holding its breath. Involuntarily, I turned toward the entrance, and for a brief moment I saw something that paralyzed me. The cafe seemed smaller as soon as that man stepped inside. His face was partially concealed by the shadow of his hood, but I saw enough to send chills down my spine. His skin was far too pale, almost gray, and his eyes, God, his eyes, deep and black, hollow, as if there was no end to them. He didn't speak or hesitate. He just stood in the doorway, waiting. The boy finally moved. He stood calmly, deliberately, as if he'd just been patiently waiting for this very moment. But before he walked away, he turned toward me. For the first time, he truly looked into my eyes and gave me a small, brief smile. A smile that wasn't relief or happiness, but something closer to farewell. Then he stepped forward, took the man's hand without a word, without looking back, and the cafe door slowly closed behind them. That very instant, the air seemed to flow again, as if that man's presence had sucked the energy from the room, and only now was it returning. I stood there, frozen, unable to process what I just witnessed. The cafe resumed its usual hum, the chatter, the clinking of cups, but nothing inside me felt normal. I looked at the barista, waiting for an explanation, anything that might help me understand. She stared at me silently, something in her eyes a mixture of pity and warning. "You shouldn't have spoken to him," she whispered quietly, as if afraid even the air would carry her words. My stomach churned. What was he? My voice barely rose above a whisper. The barista looked away, uselessly wiping the already dry counter. "We don't know. He appears from time to time. always the same, always waiting, and always leaves with someone. The cup the boy had left was still there, untouched, completely cold, as if he'd never really been there at all. Then I noticed there were no footprints leading to the door, as if, despite everything I'd seen, he had never truly been here. I left the cafe without saying another word. The cold air hit my face but didn't clear the heaviness in my chest. The boy had been there. I'd spoken to him. I'd watched that man take him away. But now, walking through empty streets, I began to wonder if anyone else had truly seen it. Would he still have disappeared if I had left sooner? If I hadn't spoken to him, would everything still have unfolded exactly the same? Or worse, if I'd lingered longer, would I have been the one he'd been waiting for? Since that day, I've never returned to that cafe. I never sought more answers. But sometimes, when I'm sitting alone elsewhere, that familiar sensation returns. The air grows heavier. The silence stretches out. And for a brief moment, I'm haunted by the memory of a small boy, cold hands wrapped around an untouched cup, waiting, always waiting. My throat went dry. His voice wasn't what I'd expected. It was low, slow, as if he hadn't spoken in a long time, or as if he was testing the words for the first time. I tried to appear indifferent, even though my heart was hammering against my ribs. "Yes, we close at 4, I responded, forcing my voice to stay steady. He didn't react. Didn't blink, didn't move a muscle in his face. He just slipped his hand into his coat pocket. My breath caught. My feet wanted to run, but I couldn't move. The cafe was completely empty. No one was there to witness what was about to happen. The silence was so intense that I could hear the ticking of the wall clock. Finally, he pulled something from his pocket, a folded piece of paper. He placed it on the counter, slowly and deliberately pushed it toward me, then turned and walked toward the door. My body froze, suspended in that moment. When he left, I glanced at the clock. It was exactly 4 a.m. My hands shook as I picked up the paper. It was crumpled, damp around the edges as though it had been held for a very long time. I swallowed hard before opening it. Inside was just a single sentence, written in shaky, irregular handwriting. "You see me." My heart raced. What did that mean? Of course I saw him. I saw him every night. But why had he written that? What was he trying to tell me? The silence inside the cafe became unbearable, as if even the air was holding its breath along with me. Fear began to take over my body, but something worse followed. The need to know more. I rushed to the door and looked outside, trying to see him on the street. But he wasn't there. The asphalt was empty. No sign of someone having just left. No footsteps. No shadow disappearing around the corner. It was as if he'd never been there at all. But the crumpled paper in my hand said otherwise. He had been there. He had seen me. And somehow he knew I saw him too. I closed the cafe as quickly as I could that night. My hands were still trembling as I locked the door, the crumpled piece of paper heavy in my pocket, an unbearable weight. I tried to forget, tried convincing myself it was just a strange man, someone lonely seeking attention. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple, because after that night he never came back. The table where he used to sit remained empty. No one else sat there, as though the spot still belonged to him. Yet he never returned. I thought his absence would bring relief, but it brought something else instead. Fear. Not because he had disappeared, but because now I missed him. Every night, at exactly 3:57 a.m., I found myself staring at that table, hoping he'd be there. But he never was. And that terrified me more than anything, because if he saw me, and now I couldn't see him, where was he watching me from now? Story 4. Working the night shift at a 24-hour cafe had never been the best job, but it paid the bills. I had grown accustomed to the rhythm, groups of students pulling all-nighters, exhausted drivers grabbing coffee to keep driving, drunk couples laughing loudly after a night out. But there was always that hour when things went quiet. Between 3 and 4 in the morning, the cafe would become almost empty, leaving only the strangest customers. That's how I noticed him. The man was always there, every night, without fail. He sat at the same table, in the farthest corner, right by the window. He never ordered anything, he never fiddled with a phone, never spoke to anyone. He just sat there, hands resting on the table, watching. At first I thought he was waiting for someone. Then I figured maybe he was just a lonely guy seeking silent companionship. But night after night, he was there, always in the same position, always watching the door as though waiting for something. And it was only when I realized he never entered or left that I began to feel genuinely disturbed. During the first week, I tried to ignore him. There were stranger customers, and as long as he wasn't bothering anyone, it wasn't my problem. But something started bothering me. Nobody else seemed to notice he was there. The other employees never mentioned him, and customers sat at adjacent tables without even glancing his way. But I saw him, and the more attention I paid, the more certain I became that something was wrong. He never moved his hands from the table, never changed his posture, never glanced at his watch. He was simply waiting. It was on one of the quietest nights that I noticed the most unsettling detail. I was at the counter, distractedly scrolling through my phone, when I raised my eyes and instinctively glanced at him, and found him already looking directly at me. For the first time, a chill ran down my spine, and my body reacted before my mind did. I blinked, and when I opened my eyes again, he was no longer watching me. It was as if nothing had happened, as if I'd imagined it, but I knew I hadn't. After that night, I couldn't ignore him anymore. I felt his presence constantly. Even when I tried to busy myself at the counter, washing cups or rearranging sugar packets, my mind drifted back to him. Was he watching me again? If I looked quickly enough, would I catch him in the act? A silent game began between us, unnoticed by anyone else. I avoided looking, but I knew he was there. I knew, somehow, he was waiting for something. The nights became unbearable. I began arriving at work already anxious, with a heaviness in my chest I couldn't explain. Then, it happened. The cafe clock showed 3:57 a.m. when I heard his chair scrape against the floor. For the first time, he moved. My blood froze. Instinctively, I glanced at his table, and there he was, standing, staring directly at me. My body went rigid. I could barely breathe. He walked slowly toward the counter, stopped in front of me, and spoke for the first time. "You close in 3 minutes." Closing the cafe had always been my favorite part of the shift. After an entire day dealing with hurried customers and complicated orders, the silence of the early morning hours came as a relief. I would turn off the lights in the dining area, check to make sure the chairs were stacked, and head to the register in the back, where I'd count the money before going home. Always the same ritual, every night. But that night, something felt different. I just didn't know exactly what. Everything seemed normal until I heard the noise. A dry, scraping sound, as if someone were dragging a chair across the floor. My heart jumped. I was certain I was alone. The dining area had already been closed for at least 10 minutes. No customers, no living soul should have been there. Holding my breath, I glanced at the security cameras on the computer screen. And that's when I saw it. On the black and white screen, someone was sitting inside the cafe. A solitary figure at one of the tables near the door, completely still, facing directly toward the camera. But I knew the door was locked. No one could have entered. A shiver ran down my spine as I squinted, trying to see better. The camera angle wasn't ideal, but the figure appeared strange. Too pale, too still, as if it didn't belong there at all. My breathing quickened. The cafe was closed. I was alone. Or at least, I thought I was. My mind searched desperately for a logical explanation. Had a customer gotten locked in without my noticing? Had someone entered while I was distracted? But deep down, I knew neither was true, because that figure hadn't been there moments before. And worse, it was staring directly at me. My breath became shallow. The figure on the screen didn't move. It just sat there, facing the camera, as if aware I was watching. But it made no sense. I had closed the dining area myself, checked every corner. Nobody could have entered without my noticing. And yet, that chair, it hadn't been occupied before. Now, whatever it was sitting right there. I swallowed hard and glanced toward the door of the room where I was standing. The only thing separating me from the dining area was a thin piece of wood. If I opened it, I'd be face to face with whatever it was. My entire body screamed at me to run, but my mind refused to accept the impossible. I needed to see with my own eyes. My hand trembled as I reached for the doorknob, slowly turning it. The door creaked open. Raising my head, I looked out into the dark cafe. The dining area was empty, completely empty. Tables neatly arranged, chairs stacked just as I'd left them. There was no one there. My chest rose and fell quickly as my eyes scanned the room, searching for any sign of movement. But there was nothing. Everything was exactly as it had been before, except for one thing. Story 5. Closing the cafe had always been my favorite part of the shift. After an entire day dealing with rushed customers and complicated orders, the silence of early morning was a relief. I'd turn off the lights in the dining area, double-check that all chairs were stacked, then head to the back register to count the money before going home. The same ritual every night. Except that night, something felt different. I just didn't know exactly what. Everything seemed normal until I heard the noise. A dry scraping sound, as if someone was dragging a chair across the floor. My heart jumped. I was sure I was alone. The cafe had been closed for at least 10 minutes. No customers, no living soul should have been there. I held my breath and glanced at the security cameras displayed on the computer screen. And that's when I saw it. On the black and white camera feed, someone was sitting inside the cafe. A lone silhouette at a table near the door. Completely motionless, staring directly at the camera. But I knew the door was locked. No one could have entered. A shiver crawled up my spine as I squinted, trying to get a clearer view. The camera angle wasn't great, but the figure looked strange. Too pale, too still, like it didn't belong there. My breathing grew rapid. The cafe was closed. I was alone, or so I had thought. My mind scrambled for a logical explanation. Maybe a customer got locked inside without me noticing. Maybe someone had snuck in while I was distracted. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that, because that person wasn't there before. And the worst part, it was staring right at me. My breath became shallow. The figure on the screen didn't move. It just sat there, facing the camera as though it knew I was watching. But it made no sense. I'd locked the dining area, checked every corner. No one could have entered unnoticed. Yet now, inexplicably, that chair was occupied. I swallowed hard, glancing at the door separating me from the dining area. A thin piece of wood was all that stood between us. If I opened it, I'd come face to face with whatever was out there. My entire body screamed at me to run, but my mind refused to accept the impossible. I needed to see it for myself. My hand shook as I reached for the doorknob, slowly turning it. The door creaked as it opened. Taking a deep breath, I lifted my head and peered into the dark cafe. The dining area was empty, completely empty. Tables perfectly arranged, chairs stacked just as I'd left them. No one was there. My chest rose and fell quickly as my eyes scanned the room for any sign of movement. Nothing. Everything was exactly the same as before, except for one thing.